The business of medicine is constantly changing. The review by Resolve discusses current contract issues for physicians, compensation trends, and tips for a successful career. Every physician's contract and career is different, and nothing in this episode should be considered legal advice. If you have specific questions about your career, please consult with an attorney. Now, on to the show.
Zach, Beare, welcome back to the review.
Thank you.
Thanks for chatting again. We're going to talk today about malpractice insurance.
Okay.
And one, why they need it, right? Two, how it shows up in the contract. And then three, what are some of those, danger zone issues or problems, with the language, specifically around tail coverage, and kind of a discussion around that. So do you want to start out and just walk me through what is malpractice insurance very quickly? Why do we have to have it? Kind of start there.
Sure. So obviously malpractice insurance, it's very important. It's a big item within these physician employment contracts. It protects you from any lawsuit, any malpractice claim against you. And it's definitely one of the top items I'm looking at within physician contracts.
Yeah, and most physicians, I think, are aware enough of this issue that they're paying attention to it too.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, most physicians will be sued, right, at some point in their career. I mean, that's very common. And so you have to have an understanding of, financially, what's my exposure when we get to that point. So you have to have the insurance in place. Almost every employer is going to do that while you're under contract, right? What happens though post-termination? What's the concern for the physician at that point?
Yeah, so post-termination, there's what's called a claims-based policy or there's occurrence-based policy, and you're going to want to look at your contract terms and figure out what type of policy do I have.
So why does the policy type matter?
Because claims-based, it ends upon your termination, where you're going to have to purchase what's called tail coverage, extended reporting endorsement.
Right, it's framed different ways.
Yeah.
They call it a little different thing.
Yep.
So claims-made coverage protects you from any claim that comes in, right? But it ends the day your employment stops. So you no longer have that coverage after, which is why then you mentioned tail.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Correct.
What's the other most common type of policy that we see?
Occurrence-based.
Okay.
Where occurrence-based, you don't need to worry about tail coverage, so it's typically better just because you don't have to worry about purchasing a $1,000 tail coverage policy. Occurrence-based will cover you no matter when the claim's brought.
Right. So it's covering your act of malpractice. It doesn't matter when the patient sues. It's just you did it in 2024, and so we cover you for that forever. Those tend to be a little more expensive, right? It costs a little bit more for the employer, and so we see a lot of employers with claims-made coverage in the document, which is why you need to know what happens with tail. So when you're buying a tail policy, is that a one-time payment, or is that I pay for it every single year forever? In your experience, how is it framed in the contract usually?
The tail coverage or the normal?
The tail, yeah.
Yeah, the tail is one-time
payment.
Yep.
Yeah. So the cost on that, this is just purely a financial issue, right? For a physician, they're going to go out, they're going to get the coverage. It's just a cost item. What's the average cost of tail? And this is going to vary by specialty, right?
Yeah.
So how do they go out calculating?
So there's a lot of factors that go into it. There's years of experience, there's your malpractice history, your specialty. I would say, just throwing out a range, it could be anywhere from 10,000 to 50,000.
Yeah. It really varies by specialty. And I agree with you. So we don't see a lot of quotes come in, right? Because this is kind of after, right, the clients have left us. But, from what we've heard on people that have terminated a contract, it can be some specialties like OB can be a six-figure number, right? A really big number. And some specialties, it's a couple thousand, right? Where it's not a big deal. So, or not as big of a deal. So financially, if you need to be aware of that, right? Of what that looks like. Do most contracts start out, if it's a claims-made policy, where where the employer is paying for tail, or is the physician being stuck with that cost?
You definitely want to check the contract language and see what it says, but typically the employer is paying for all premiums throughout your employment.
Right.
The tail coverage, it kind of varies, where if you're working for a hospital or a larger healthcare employer, I would say 99% of the time they're covering tail.
Yeah.
If it's private practice, it varies a little bit.
Sure. So there's, in my mind, there's kind of four different ways that tail shows up in a document. Do you want to kind of walk us through what that spectrum looks like?
Sure. we touched on claims base where you're purchasing a tail policy. It's
Right.
a one-time payment. There's occurrence base where you're covered no matter when the claim is brought.
Right.
There's self-insured policies where it's a little bit different, but similar to an occurrence-based policy where it's going to cover you throughout the entire period of time.
Yeah.
And then there's also certain states that you would have to look into what their state policy is on malpractice, and there's a chance that that state might cover your tail.
Yeah, so there's some states that actually have programs in place where they're gonna cover the tail costs, so you don't have to worry about it in the contract as much. That's perfect. So if you're in a situation where it's a claims made policy, it's my responsibility to pay for it as a physician. They're not going to cover it. What are a couple edits that you might suggest to share that cost, shift the cost, give some outs to the physician? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, I think sharing it 50-50, that's always a suggestion. I oftentimes suggest a vesting schedule where the employer is going to cover a certain percentage based on your years of service there.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you work there for 5 years, they're going to cover all tail expenses after that 5-year employment period.
So you get
of time.
credit. The longer you're there, the more they pay. Yep. Okay.
Those are a couple options. There's also termination language you can add where if the employer terminates you without cause, let's say they just fire you for no reason, it just seems fair that they would cover tail costs in that situation.
Kind of a no-fault issue on my end, and you take the cost over for me. Perfect. Okay. So to give a quick recap on malpractice insurance, one, you have to have it, right? You need to know if you have any issues with claims coming in after you leave that job, which is what's called tail or an extended reporting endorsement, right? In the contract, you need to know who pays for that. And you also need to know if your state has a program that might cover that for you if it's void in the contract itself. Anything else I missed?
Coverage limits.
Oh, yeah. Let's talk about that quick.
Yeah.
Good. So how much malpractice insurance should you have?
The standard limits we typically see are 1 million, 3 million.
Right.
Where we're kind of looking for those numbers within most contracts.
Yeah.
Again, states differ. There are states that have tort reform, cap limits on the damages that you'll have to pay in a malpractice suit in place. So you'd have to look at state statutes and what are my potential liabilities and what's the cap on damages.
So if a state has capped it, let's say 200, 600, right, thousand of liability, you're not going to insure past that, right? I mean, employers don't want to have a policy that's too expensive, so they may have coverage limits of 2 and 6 versus 1 million, 3 million. Right? It can vary by state.
Yep.
Most common, I agree with you, is 1 million, 3 million.
Yeah.
Good. I forgot about that, so I appreciate you bringing that up. Thanks for talking about malpractice insurance, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you.
You bet.